This lecture is an overview of Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. I'll upload Chapter 11 and 12 separately. This is a very heavy week. I realize that there's 4 chapters for you guys to read and quite a bit of assignments. You've got 2 discussions and a quiz. Take your time with those assignments. If you need extra time because it is heavy, just let me know. I know that your modules, I do not allow for late modules, but I recognize that this is pretty heavy. So, just reaching out to me is the best course of action here if it gets to be too heavy. But this video is going to be just specifically for Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is pretty straightforward, so I'm going to spend a little less time on that, a little bit more time on Chapter 5. Chapter 5 discusses the idea of oppression, systemic oppression. It discusses the idea of credibility. So as a counselor, what makes us credible? And what makes us credible from our perspective, what makes us credible from the educational perspective, but more importantly, what makes us credible or viewed as credible from our clients. So what goes into play when a client determines that we are credible, that we are trustworthy, that we are the counselor for them, and then we know what we're talking about. So before we sort of jump into the chapter, I'm curious about your perception or your thoughts and feelings on the case of Malachi. What are your thoughts on this case study? Were the stereotypes made by the counselor obvious to you? Were they subtle? Were they stereotypes that maybe you have thought of or you have felt? What are your thoughts on the statement the counselor made that he wanted to treat his client like everyone else? What are your feelings and your thoughts at the end of the case study where the counselor indicated that he really wanted to get a sense of working with African American males because he wanted to better help this population, and so he wanted to know the multiculturalisms of the African American, as if the problem was with the African American as opposed to these stereotypes and microaggressions and oppressions and statements and feelings that the counselor had in his description. Sit with that for a second and think about how this sort of played out as he was writing it. It was very clear that he had no idea and no thought that the problem was with him, not with the client. That the client was acting out of his worldview. The client was emoting from his worldview and his perspective, not from the counselor's. And those two things did not meet. Those two things did not connect. Certainly did not connect for the client, for the counselor. Moving on, this next PowerPoint sort of discusses all of the items that happened to be in this case study. So there were very clear stereotyping examples. There were some implicit stereotypes, some covert stereotypes that were certainly in. There was definitely examples of victim blaming, objectifying, pathologizing the client. The idea that he assumed that it was these components of being an African American male that furthered these stereotypes. Was certainly blaming his behavior on him being an African American male, being paranoid, being hostile, being violent, and not in any way, shape, or form did he sort of acknowledge, recognize, or was aware of any sort of perspectives of oppression that this individual may have experienced, certainly did experience. This was not part of the counselor's worldview. So these are examples of sort of the way that our bias or our preconceived views of an individual, of a marginalized group or a minority group can affect our work. So this individual went into this counselor. You can see these clear examples of how his worldview affected his work with that client, and more than likely any client that came across his office space that maybe fit into these stereotypes or preconceived ideas that he had about them. So the important question to ask is my work with my client coming from my perspective or their worldview? Is there any way for me to understand and be aware of their perspective and their worldview? Is it enough to just ask? These are all questions I want you to think about. Your book goes into talking about the concept of ethnocentric monoculturalism. So this is the idea that individuals, institutions, and societies have superiority over group heritage, minority group's heritage, one group's heritage, and that there is this dominant group, or there are, in various stages and circumstances, maybe dominant groups. So in this idea, this dominant group has ultimate power to impose beliefs, to impose standards, and sort of just a way of functioning and being around these less powerful groups. So the idea that the group in power sort of sets the rules. So let's think about that for a minute. How has that played out in your experience being a member of the group that you are a member of? Does this fit? Does this make sense? Do you see where this has happened? An example that came to mind to me would be, well, let me stop there. Let me stop on that example and let me ask you this one question here. If you're a member of a dominant group, can you be oppressed? So if you are looking at this definition, if you are a member of a group or society has ultimate power to impose beliefs and standards upon a less powerful group, can you also be oppressed? Is that possible? So the example that I was referencing earlier that I want to bring back up for your review is a fairly current argument or outcry from sort of in the United States, more Christian or faith-based groups that have asserted that their right to be Christian, their right to be believe in faith and believe in Jesus and believe in God has been infringed upon by minority group members. So the idea that we have, that there's a limitation on their ability to be Christian, their ability to be upfront and vocal and proud of and display their Christianity, and that there is this act of oppression on them. So I think we could all agree that if you are, let's just say, a white male Christian, you are a member of a dominant group. If you sort of separate some of these ideas, if you're just Christian in the United States, you're a member of a dominant group, potentially. Of course, we have to consider intersectionality, but let's say you're a member of this dominant group. Can you be oppressed? That's just a question I want you to sit with, and we'll come back to that maybe next time we meet, and I want to explore those ideas with you guys. So if we go through the examples or the sort of different characteristics of how ethnocentric monoculturalism plays out and the way that this looks, you've got a couple of different examples here, or you've got a couple of different categories. So belief in the superiority of a dominant group. So this is the idea that the dominant group is far superior. And there are several examples of this, referring to other groups, other marginalized groups, other countries, other cultures, other heritages. Heritages? I don't know if that's correct. Other marginalized groups as being less than. The idea that conforming physically to what the dominant group could and should look like is an example of this. So going through, Christianity is superior to other religions. Again, if you're a Christian, you are in the dominant group, at least in that perspective, that piece of potentially you, considering all these other pieces of your culture and identity. And we talked about this in the last class, the idea that autonomy and individualism is not necessarily highly valued. So just assuming that this worldview is the dominant group is obviously is a category and an example. Belief in the idea belief in the inferiority of the other. So the idea that there is this them versus us, a dominant versus subdominant, or if that's even a word. The idea that there is the better group and the not so better group. And the power to impose standards. The dominant group proposing those standards on non-dominant groups. And sort of this ties into the question that I asked you. If one group has power, then others do not. And so that asserts an inequality. If you have all the power, can you be unequal? Going on, manifestations of an institution. So you've heard a lot about institutional racism, and certainly, the examples of NFL come to mind, and the idea that the system is set up, and it may have been set up for so long that it's not even, it's just a way of their culture, a way of their company, a way of doing business, a way of being that oppresses individuals. And then the invisible veil. So the idea that some of our biases and some of our racism and some of our prejudice exists on such a subconscious level, and it's been so ingrained in us for generations over generations over generations, we don't even know it exists. So my question to you is, what are your invisible veils? What are the ways that, and this is for you to think, this is more rhetorical, I think, but what are the ways that you act, you behave, you operate, you function in a way that may be oppressive to other individuals? I want to move down, because like I said, we don't have a ton of, this is just sort of a brief overview. I want to talk about credibility, expertness, and trustworthiness. Just the concept or the construct of being an expert in something, being credible or being trustworthy. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? But more importantly, what does that mean to your client? Are you viewing these concepts through their lens, or are you viewing it from your lens? The idea of being credible is different in different groups, and different through different cultures and different ethnicities. What it takes to deem someone trustworthy is not the same for all. It's interesting. My daughter asked me what the word trust meant. Being 5 years old, I didn't really know how to answer this question. And ironically, it was sort of after re-reviewing some of this information, and I was stumped. I really didn't know how to answer that question for her, because from my perspective, it's one thing. My perspective is my perspective. So, we have to make sure that we are mindful of the idea that while we know that the relationship and rapport that we have with our clients is such a significant factor in our work with our clients, and the relationship, we've preached this to you guys over and over again, the relationship is key, but what drives the development of that relationship can drastically depend upon your client's worldview and how they determine those factors that are related to credibility, related to trustworthiness, related to being able to develop rapport. And so the locus of control and locus of responsibility. So this helps explain how our worldview is developed. The sort of the formation of how we view things, how we see things, and the basis of our perception. And pay real close attention to locus of control and locus of responsibility, particularly that graph. This, and I think you have an assignment that asks you to identify your sort of place, your role, and where you lie, where your worldview is being formed from and through. This is really important piece to this chapter. Again, it helps explain the formation of our worldview, but also our client's worldview. So really quickly going into chapter 6, because I don't have too much more time on this recording, I want to make sure that you guys are aware of those intentional and unintentional ways that we can express either verbal or behavioral forms of oppression, those microaggressions, the ways that we speak to individuals that marginalize them, that place them into these stereotypical categories, that display negativity, display differences, and that they're not necessarily they're not necessarily always expressed in language, and that our behaviors can also be oppressive. So some of the things, you don't sound very blunt.